We can start recording the webinar now, and if you wish to not show up in that recording, you can turn off your video, but I love seeing everybody's faces. All right, so let's talk about the objectives for this webinar on running effective meetings. The objectives today are to identify the elements of good meetings and explore the ways to implement them. We're also going to review those Roger Schwarz's 8 behaviors for smarter teams that we talked about at the last webinar on group norms for effective communication. We'll also explore some tools for facilitating group decision-making. And then we'll consider some tips for facilitating virtual meetings, which due to coronavirus, we've had to do a little bit more of. So, and it's good to kind of flex that new skill set, I think. All right, so I want us to start with a little bit of a brainstorming activity. I want us to think about a meeting that we've attended recently that went really, really well. What made that meeting successful? I want us to also think about a meeting that we've attended that did not go well. What made that meeting bad or ineffective? So let's brainstorm that together. I'm going to go ahead and pull up a whiteboard, which is a function that you can utilize in Zoom when you're hosting virtual meetings. Can everybody see the whiteboard now? Shake your head. Okay, cool. Okay, I'm gonna admit Sandy into the room too. She's coming at a great time. We're gonna start brainstorming together. So I do invite you to unmute yourself and shout out, or you can use the chat function if you'd prefer, to list the quality of a good meeting. What made that meeting good?
Good reception.
Good reception.
That's important.
That is very important, and having internet access is definitely a consideration to take when you're hosting a meeting remotely.
And no background noise, because sometimes I think if they use the call-in feature as well as the video, sometimes you get that background noise. I don't know. I'm sure it has a technical term, but I don't know it.
Yes, no, yeah, background noise is definitely a factor to consider. What are some other qualities that make a meeting really successful?
I think you've got to feel like you accomplished something, that you're not wheel spinning.
I definitely agree. It always feels good when you've accomplished something during a meeting. Anyone else have any things that they feel like are a quality of a really good meeting?
If you stay on the agenda and don't stray from it, like, you know, get on a rabbit chase is what we call it here in the mountains, like somebody takes off and then you're so far off topic.
You're on the rabbit hole.
Yes, and I think we're identifying some things right now that we want to do like the opposite of. So like a quality of a bad meeting would be rabbit chasing and not staying on task, right? So we're kind of doing both at the same time, which I think is great. Does anybody have any of those things that they think are good quality? Sorry, Kathy, you go. Okay, sorry.
She's going to take a phone call. Oh.
I got it. Randy, do you have any?
I would just think, you know, making sure you got the key people at the table. I mean, at the meeting, the key players, key partners. And again, so like someone said, making sure you stay on track. I sit on a lot of committees, and a lot of times you'll go to a committee meeting, and it seems like you'll spend an hour there and you'll talk 45 minutes about stuff that don't relate to what you're there for, and 15 minutes on the topic. So I think the key people, having to make sure you have the key people there is a huge thing.
Yeah, that is definitely crucial. Sandy, do you have any others, or Karen?
Well, being a person who signed in late, I'm going to go ahead and just say, you know, it's always nice if, you know, your participants get there on time. Sorry about that, guys.
No, it's completely fine. And that is definitely something, you know, I think that's a common thing for people to, you know, struggle with, starting and ending on time and having everybody there. Does anybody else have any other qualities that they think are a quality of a good meeting?
I think it's also good when people come prepared. If they know ahead of time what the meeting's going to be about,
right,
then they read the stuff that they need to read or be ready to talk about things.
Well, and I want to throw in another one, and that is that the facilitator does not allow one or two individuals to dominate all the discussion, that there is some ability to bring in everyone.
Yeah, and that's a great skill. And how do we encourage, you know, contributions from every single player on our team? Any other ones before we end this little brainstorming activity? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and save this. So this is a great tool to use. So I clicked on the share button in my toolbar, and then I clicked on whiteboard, and then you're able to do all these really cool things. So we're gonna dive back into this, but you can click save, and then it will save it down. So if you wanted to share this out with meeting materials after the meeting with the minutes, you could do that as well. All right, I'm gonna go, yeah.
One question, sorry. Do you have to be the host to do that for the whiteboard?
No, that's a great question, Kathy. So I was able to, in the toolbar, click on the security, which you all probably won't be able to see because you're not the meeting host, but in the toolbar, you'll see security, and then you click on that, and it has a drop down, and you can allow participants to share their screen. So you have to click that. And then you also, something that we could have done and we will do later on in this call is we'll pull that back up, and we'll allow everybody to annotate on that shared document. So you can also, in that security setting, click on annotate on shared content, and that is also how you can get people to be able to contribute that way. So let's go over some of the ones that our team brainstormed right before this, this meeting, which a lot of these were covered already, but the purpose of the meeting is clear, right? So having that agenda and sticking to it. Meetings are held at a time that's convenient for the majority of the group, and it's also in an accessible location for everybody to be able to get there. The meeting begins and ends on time, and people show up on time. Attendees are sent materials in advance so that they're prepared for the meeting. Right, attendees are prepared for the meeting, and they know their roles, and everyone is able to contribute their ideas. So we have buy-in from each member of the board. And then the important points and decisions from the meeting are recorded in the meeting notes. So making sure that you have somebody to fulfill that responsibility each time is important. And then decisions are made and also supported by the entire group. That's another, I think, a quality of an effective meeting. So now that we've kind of thought about those qualities of effective meetings, let's recap on what we talked about at the last webinar, which were the mutual learning behaviors outlined by Roger Schwarz. So that first one is to state views and ask genuine questions. So we talked about this last time. So what do you all think when you hear state views and ask genuine questions? I think to me, the thing that sticks out the most is that and, because if we're just stating views, then it can lead to kind of unproductive just monologues or maybe even arguments instead of switching to a conversation in which we're gaining deeper understanding by asking those genuine questions after we follow up. So a tip that I have for you all in your next board meeting is to, while people are talking during the board meeting, you can keep a tally of your own statements and questions, or just the group statements and questions, and take just like a tally on a piece of paper of how many viewpoints are shared, and then keep a separate tally of how many genuine questions are asked after people share their views. If the numbers of the tallies are, the same, or even if they skew a little bit more towards the questions, the genuine questions that are being asked, then I think that that shows that people are wanting to gain a deeper understanding instead of just advocate for their viewpoint. Does anybody have any other things to add about what you think this looks like in a board meeting?
I'll just throw in that asking genuine questions can be just an effect, especially in this time when we see so many groups of people indicating that they're not being heard, that they are, being sidelined, that asking genuine questions with authenticity can go a long way for just helping that without necessarily having to jump in and agree or disagree or counter and all that other stuff, but it just shows your willingness to understand.
I completely agree. I think it goes back to that value of compassion as well that we need to have for these behaviors to work. So the second one is to share all relevant information. So sharing all relevant information just enables the whole board to develop a comprehensive, common set of information with which to solve their problems and also to make decisions. And then the third one is to use specific examples and agree on what important words mean. So this ensures that all of the team members are using the same words to mean the same thing. Donna shared a story in the last webinar about two people who were in the same workshop track who were using the word fuzzy to mean different things. So one person they were talking about a marketing message for tourism, And somebody was using the word fuzzy to describe this warm feeling that they got about the messaging and how it made them feel warm and fuzzy. And then the other person said, oh no, that's fuzzy. And they were having this miscommunication because the other person's understanding of the word fuzzy was that it was unclear and it wasn't very concrete. So they were having this miscommunication when talking about the same thing, but just they had a different understanding of what that word meant. And Donna, feel free to jump in if you have any other clarifying. So this fuzzy story is pretty benign, but it's particularly important to define what important words mean to your group when we are defining your values for your group, right? So if you guys are defining your values, like the word respect, different people might think that respect means different things. So it's really important to define what that value is for your group. Then the fourth one is to explain your reasoning and intent. So I know that we just did that brainstorming activity and we weren't really explaining our reasoning and intent during that. And that's not really the point of brainstorming activities, but in a discussion, in a conversation, you want to explain your reasoning and how you reached your conclusion so that other people can understand your reasoning and just be able to see your perspective a little bit better. Does anybody have any other comments about how they see these behaviors play out in meetings? All right, so we're gonna go through the rest of these behaviors from Roger Schwarz. The next one is focus on interests, not positions. So I think that this is particularly important when you are doing group decision-making. So instead of focusing on positions, it's important to develop criteria that everybody in the group agrees on. So if a solution or decision doesn't meet the agreed upon criteria, it would just get removed from those options. And this behavior helps a group move forward. Oops. Can everybody see that? Okay. This helps the group move forward. So it also helps the focus on interests help the board to develop solutions that the whole team is committed to. So has anybody ever seen this behavior in group decision making? So we'll talk about the next behavior, which is to test our assumptions and our inferences. I think that we all kind of subconsciously tell ourselves stories and assumptions to kind of make sense of our experiences. But it's really important to just recognize when we are making an assumption, we're climbing that ladder. So it's important to kind of test that assumption, right? So we just need to check in with if we're making an assumption about how a person feels, we can just ask them and, you know, test that assumption. Say, I'm feeling this way. I'm feeling like you're upset with me maybe. And that person then can tell you what the issue actually is as opposed to you just holding on to this assumption and carrying it with you. And then the next behavior is to jointly design next steps. So jointly designing next steps helps to make sure that everybody is committed to moving forward as a team. So if you were creating an agenda for your board meeting, you could propose that agenda to the board members and then say what changes, if any, do you think need to be made to this agenda? So that's kind of what jointly designing those next steps looks like to me. Do you guys see that play out in your board meetings?
Yes, but in the same manner that getting folks to participate in the webinar, folks get very quiet and they just, you know, they're kind of like, well, it's okay. And I don't have any real problems. So I'll just, you know, I'll just nod. So quit laughing, Randy.
The last one on here is to discuss those undiscussable issues, which I think is a lot easier said than done sometimes, but this really ensures that the team is able to talk about things that are hindering its results and that can only be resolved in a team meeting. Mm-hmm. So my tip after going through these ground rules are to either use these or develop your own ground rules and maybe post them in the room in which you hold your meeting, or maybe remind people of the ground rules prior to when the meeting starts to just kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page, and also to be able to hold one another accountable so that if you see somebody going against the behaviors that your group has already aligned out, you can point it out to people. So yeah, do you all have ground rules for your meetings, and are they actionable items like this? Like, you know, jointly design next steps is a behavior. All of these are behaviors that we can see happening. Do you all have ground rules like this?
At the Upper Cumberlands, I think the only one we have is just Roger's Rules of Order. And you know, we stumble with it, okay, because we don't all know the Roger Rules of Order, but we do try to implement that. But we don't have all the positions. We don't have like a sergeant of arms, you know, and those types of things. But that's as close to, I think, a structure as we've come up with.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have like a structure like that. And I think it's a little bit different than having like behaviors that the group is following, but it's so important. It is something that sometimes we have a difficult time understanding, or I know at least I do.
Can I make a quick
Yeah.
comment, Jacqueline?
Yes, yes.
That with the Robert's Rules of Order, many times, you know, those are very traditional, very formal. And there are times when you're working with a volunteer group that those types of, that way of decision making and that type of order is not necessarily the best way to go. And so, and it might be on a board, you know, because a board is a very structured thing. But I think sometimes I've seen groups use blended things between more of a consensus decision-making model and Robert's Rules of Order. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in this webinar, I think, when we talk about some facilitation techniques. But the only other thing I want to share real quickly is that as Sandy and I have been talking a bit about doing a retreat for the Upper Cumberland Board in terms of their strategic planning piece of work, then we've also talked about maybe creating some of these ground rules that board puts together in their own language. So we'll do that as part of the facilitation. And we could do that for other boards as well. So.
Yeah, September 23rd.
All right, September 23rd.
Nice.
Yeah.
Randy, did you have a comment too?
You know, I think that you've pointed out a lot of good things. I sit on a lot of committees, a lot of boards, and I really never, and I've been around a long time. I kind of got tickled. You know, I was sitting here nodding when Sandy said, "Don't laugh." I'm one of those guys that was just nodding, going along with everything. But you know, I really never thought about all this stuff in all these committees and boards. I've been around a long time and sit on a lot of committees and boards, and there's a lot of good information here that I think could really help make a lot of these committees more productive and more successful if they just really had access to all this information. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to share this with us afterwards so that we can take this to some of these other committees and boards and help them grow and develop them into a good, solid board.
Okay, wonderful. And we are posting all these to the Foundation's YouTube channel. So they're all there, and we are sending out the link post this webinar. Sandy, did you have another comment?
I did, and that led to, that was a question I had somewhere to ask, and that is, we've had like, this is like our third one of these, or fourth one. And is there any way to find out who's accessing and downloading the YouTube videos so that we would have an idea of how much our board members are taking advantage of this great resource?
I think that there is a way to check on who's viewed it. So
Okay.
I can check in on that, and we'll talk to the Foundation about that since we're posting them to their YouTube channel. But I think that we can download a report to see maybe who watched it, but we'll check on that.
That would be great. And if you could supply that to maybe the officers or something like that, we could develop a technique, you know, like we could like send out a joint email congratulating these people who've looked at, you know, and, you know, just try to create some reminders that this is available and should be checked out.
Yeah, and I like that idea to encourage people to attend these kind of like learning and networking opportunities. So that's great.
Yes.
Any other comments right now? All right, well, let's talk about preparing for your board's meeting. So a good place to start is deciding where will your board meet. So I want to talk about what are some factors that you all think about when you're deciding on where your board will meet.
Well, first of all, Karen, which board are you which affiliate are you coming in from?
Breathitt County.
Breathitt County. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Well, I will just say that when it comes to the Upper Cumberlands, because we're a regional, the first thing we look at is there one spot that doesn't, you know, that everybody has to travel really far. You know, it's a logistics issue. And about the only thing we have found thus far is a restaurant close to the interstate.
Nice. So is that somewhere that you consistently hold your meetings?
Yep, that's before the pandemic. That's where, but we also always had the option to Zoom. So you could if you wanted to get up early and drive in, you could, but you could also join us with Zoom, which creates kind of an interesting. I've noticed that completely Zoom meetings seem to be more productive than these hybrids, simply because I think it's very difficult to have the Zoom participants feel like there is this part of the discussion as Facebook's. So I've got to explore some more on how to do hybrids.
Yeah, and that is something that, sorry, Karen, you go. You look like you have a question.
We have 2 board members who do not use email. They don't use cell phones. So they're very old school.
Yeah.
So we have to send letters, and then I go by where their businesses are and make sure all of that stuff. So Zoom is completely off the table for our meetings.
Yeah.
But we have a big space, since we're all in one county. One of our board members does travel in from another county, but since we're all right there, we just we have a couple big spaces in town that we can use. Any of those board members have a big meeting space, and that way that allows us to have plenty room and those kind of things. But we have met at restaurants before a couple times when we don't have we're just discussing things and we don't have a full agenda. We'll go to one of the local restaurants and they just sit us up and we can stay there as long as we want.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And thanks for sharing about where you all kind of hold your meetings and that background about how comfortable your board members feel using technology. There is another platform that I'm going to briefly mention that other than Zoom called freeconferencecall.com, which I'm fairly confident that you can use a landline to call in to join that conference call. And it's a free platform. You can't see one another, but if you had to not meet in person and you wanted to do a conference, like a remote meeting, freeconferencecall.com is pretty user-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
So like you guys were already talking about, you're talking about, the accessibility of your meeting space. Is it a good location for everybody to travel to? Also, is your space comfortable? That's a really good thing to consider as well. So does everybody in the room have easy access to be able to see everything that they need to see if you're using a flip chart or a dry erase board or a projector even? Can they see it? Can they hear everyone in the room? If you're hosting the meeting online and using Zoom, or doing some sort of hybrid model, it's also important to consider everybody's, accessibility. We mentioned at the beginning, broadband access and access to internet. So that's really important to consider. And also, if you are hosting a meeting in a physical space, just checking in and not assuming what all of your board members will need, but just checking in and asking about what kind of accommodations they might need if you are meeting in a physical space, to make sure that the physical space has those accommodations, or you're able to secure them. All right, and then in preparation for your meeting, it's always important to send a meeting reminder. I think that we all know that our meetings typically have better attendance if we send out a reminder in advance. And then also sending in agenda items to the board members and then also the foundation staff is another task that is outlined in the affiliate manual. So I think that it says in the affiliate manual, I think that the chair is responsible for that, but if you don't have a chair or co-chair on your board, then just making sure that responsibility is being taken care of and communicating with other board members. And then, like I already mentioned, identifying any necessary materials and accommodations for your meetings. So if you are meeting virtually, making sure that people can either see the screen when you're sharing the agenda or pull it up on their computer, but if they aren't, maybe mailing them the hard copy of things or dropping it off. Are there any other considerations that you all make in preparation for your meeting, or any other things that you're supposed to send to the foundation that we've missed?
Well, we at the beginning of the year will send out an Outlook meeting for all of the quarterly meetings so that hopefully we can allow our board members not to let that time get away from them, which is very easy to do. All of a sudden you're booked up in June and you don't, are like, whoa, I forgot to remember the foundation. So we also do that. And Karen, I just want to tell you, I understand completely this whole idea that you have valuable people and they just, I have a list, not for this board, but for other things that I work on. And it's like, okay, here are the people I can text. Here are the people I have to email. Here are the people I have to call personally. man, but they're worth it. It's just, I wish they were all on the same page. It would be so much more efficient.
I'm one of those guys, I like to call. I'm not a texter. I'm not an emailer. I'm old school. When Karen was talking about her people, I'm the same way, Karen. I'm old school. This is new technology to me. I'm trying to update and stay up with it, but hey, it's a struggle. But I'm one of those guys who I like to be called too.
Well, you're all here today and you're all using this technology, so that's awesome. And also, it shows that you guys are really listening to your board members to be able to accommodate them in different ways that work best for them. Kathy, did you also have a comment to make?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So we just talked about preparing for your meeting. One of the crucial things to do in preparation for your meeting is to create an agenda. So now I'm going to turn it over to Donna to talk about a question-based agenda model, which I hope is an effective tool for you all to use if you're not already using it. All right, Donna.
So you often hear us refer to Roger Schwarz, and this is another tool that we have used that's based on some of his facilitation training that he did. And so what this talks about is actually creating an agenda where you base that agenda on a series of questions. It's a way that if you list those agenda topics as questions, the way this one is listed here as the first item, what changes, if any, should we make to the agenda? It lets the team that you're working with really understand the topic that you're talking about more clearly. But if we think about something that would be more like what you might talk about in your board meetings, if you think about, if you have an agenda item that just says donor relations. So, okay, we're talking about donor relations, but what are we talking about with donor relations? And if you phrase that instead as a question that is like, what could our community foundation do to improve our donor relations? Then that gives the group some direction in how to prepare for the discussion, what the product of the discussion is going to be. They'd understand whether the comments that they're making are on track with what you're trying to accomplish, and just really relate that question and that agenda item to what the group is trying to answer. And so it just basically keeps the conversation focused. And so there are probably some standing items that you have for your board meetings that you could think about phrasing as questions. And so does anybody have a specific standing item, something you usually talk about that you could propose a question that you might phrase it as?
We start off with committee reports.
Mm-hmm.
So we could, I guess we could say, what did the fundraising committee accomplish with it's over the last quarter?
Mm-hmm.
What does the fundraising committee propose to do in the next quarter?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe what resources does the fundraising committee need to accomplish its work, or what information?
Or better yet, how many volunteers is the fundraising committee looking for?
Yeah. So see how those questions can get pretty specific.
Yes.
So that's a way that you can really get at defining very clearly what those agenda items are. Now, you don't want 50 questions in there, obviously, but 3 or 4 good questions under an agenda item could make that that conversation be super focused and really get at what it is that you want to get at with it. The other thing that you want to do is identify who is responsible for that topic of discussion. It is not always going to be the board chair. It could be somebody else. It could be a committee member. It could be somebody from the outside that you bring in who's a specific expert on a topic and you're wanting to share out that information. And so it's very often that the person leading that particular agenda item is different than the board chair. And so, this person is going to be the person that's responsible for providing the content, for explaining the context for the topic, for providing any data. And it may be a person who has some responsibility in that area. And so it also lets the other members of the group know who's responsible for that item so that they kind of feel at ease that somebody's taking care of that.
Yeah.
And then another thing, you can see that if you look under the topic column here, that there is a section that says purpose of this agenda item. And so your discussion can have different purposes. It could be that you're just sharing information out, as with those reports. So we're just sharing information. Could be that you're trying to make a decision. So the purpose could be listed as, this is going to be a decision process that we're trying to undertake. Or it could be that you are seeking input on something, but not necessarily making the decision at that point, but you're trying to involve the committee members or the board members in giving input on whatever topic you're talking about. If you can clarify that, it lets people know that if you're just getting input, they realize we're not making a decision at this point, we're just getting input. If we know that we have to make a decision, then it guides that conversation a little bit differently. And so really listing that purpose is a pretty important piece of this. And then you want to think about how much time is it going to take for each of these agenda items. And if you really think seriously about a conversation to answer those questions, now this one says 2 minutes. What changes, if any, should we make to the agenda? You could probably get through that in a couple of minutes because not everybody in the group is going to have to respond. And hopefully the agenda had input from everybody at the beginning or before it was set or as it was being set. But if you're going to have a conversation around something that's a lot more complex than what changes, if any, should we make to the agenda? Let's say that you are having a conversation about, let's determine how many new volunteers we want to engage or new board members we want to, let's say we want to expand the size of our board and we want to have a very in-depth conversation about that. And you have 10 board members that you know are going to be involved in that conversation. If you said, we can talk about this for 10 minutes and it'll be good. And you think about 10 people for 10 minutes talking about a pretty complex issue. That's a minute per person to talk. So you can kind of go through that in your head and go, oh no, we're probably going to need more like 30 minutes for that so that we can have, more in-depth discussion, 3 minutes for people to talk a piece, something like that, which is still not a lot of time, but you can see how you can use that. Putting that time in there helps you think about really how much time that agenda item is going to take. And then if you know that all of your board meetings are going to be an hour and a half or less, it helps you figure out how many agenda items you can have. So, so estimating that amount of time. Roger Schwarz also recommends that you always make that first topic to review and modify the agenda as needed, because you do want to jointly design next steps. If you remember, that's one of his underlying kind of principles for how to do effective meetings. And by working together on this agenda, then you are jointly designing next steps. And then just simply numbering those agenda items allows people to quickly reference them. So, I have a comment on item 3 when you're doing the review of the agenda. I think we need more time on item 3. That just quickly lets people refer. So it's just a good way if you number those topics. That second column on preparation, that lets people know if there's something to be read ahead of time, be sure to read the bylaws about this. Be sure to read the committee's charge if you're going to be talking about a committee. So put in there what the group members need to do in terms of preparation for that, for the topic that you're talking about. And then think about a proposed process. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some different facilitation techniques and processes. But basically in there, we say for this particular thing, Mike is going to lead this quick decision-making process about what we're going to do with the agenda. And he just essentially polls the team. What changes, if any, should we make to the agenda? Waits for people to respond. But it could be that there's more of, we want to have small group discussions around a topic because it's got so many aspects to it. And so, and again, we'll talk more about those kinds of proposed processes. But that's essentially the overview of how to do a questions-based agenda. And it's a tool that Brushy Fork finds very helpful in our facilitation. And we think you all might too. So are there any thoughts or questions about that? Okay.
All right. So
back to Jacqueline.
Thanks, Donna. If you guys do think of any questions or comments related to the question-based agenda, or if you want to offer any insight about what are some helpful things that you do for your own meeting agendas, we'd love to hear about them. So let's talk a little bit about virtual meetings right now. We've already kind of talked about some of the barriers for board members in terms of participating in remote or virtual meetings. I mentioned free conference call as a platform. It is free. It allows up to 1,000 callers and calls for up to 6 hours long. It doesn't require access to the internet either, although it does require phone service. So it also helps to keep a record of who attended the call and for how long they were on the call. So if that's helpful information for you in terms of keeping a record of board attendance, then maybe that's a platform that you all could use if you had to meet remotely or you wanted to meet remotely. So we started talking about accessibility there. And then with the features, let's consider what kind of features you want to use and you need to use during your board meetings. So Sandy, you kind of mentioned that you all have been trying out this hybrid model. So are there any features that you all use when you're on Zoom or when you're meeting in person in terms of maybe like polling your members or trying to take a vote or trying to collaborate on a document together?
No, as a matter of fact, I mean, we are real neophytes when it comes to this. And the best that we've been able, so far is to just, it's like, hey, we've successfully got everybody on here. And I do think that we've gotten pretty good as the chairman will go and ask, it's like, okay, we've got a motion on the floor. We've got to vote on that motion, looking at the Zoom screen to see if he's got, agreement, before he declares the vote, the vote results. Of course, Kathy has been on ours very remotely often, and so has Randy. So they may have some additional comments to make as participants in these hybrid meetings. I tend to be there in person, and so they may have some ideas. In which case, I'm going to write them down.
Well, I think they do a really good job of staying on task, and they start like right on time, and they pretty much end right on time. So that's very professional, and that's great. Kudos to them, because I've been in a couple others that maybe they drag on a certain topic, and it keeps lingering for a while, and so I think they're very good about staying on task and are very diligent about getting people in and out in an hour, and that helps a lot of people because they meet early, so that allows them to get on with their day, to their job, because this is volunteer time for them.
Yeah, and that's a good consideration to take in terms of making sure that the meeting time is accessible for everyone who's attending. And then the features, I hear you guys talking about voting, so making sure that you can see people's reactions or hear their yes or no in terms of the vote. So that is kind of a feature when I'm thinking about features that you would need to have for your meeting. And then the other one to consider is cost. So it sounds like you all have some regular spaces that you meet. So I don't know if there's a fee for those spaces, but it sounds like you're meeting in locations that are free. Is that a correct assumption? Or yeah, so that's great. And that's obviously free. If you guys were paying for a space, I think that cost would be maybe something to consider in terms of your meeting location, but it sounds like you're not. In terms of having a professional account for Zoom, it's $14.99 a month to have meetings with multiple people on them for longer than 40 minutes. So that's why having a professional Zoom account would be helpful. However, there might be a board member on your board who already has a professional Zoom account through their organization, or the foundation might be able to set up a meeting through their Zoom account potentially. But those were all things I was thinking about before and thinking about virtual meetings. Were there any other things that you think should be considered before a board starts to host a virtual meeting?
I think you have to have at the beginning of your meeting, you have to have a set aside time for dealing with technical glitches. So that if you have that one person you can tell is trying to get on, but they're not doing it, that you have somebody who can like give them a call real quick and get them tuned in. And I think the other thing you have to remember with Zoom is that, or any technology, is that just because it worked this week doesn't mean you won't have that technical glitch next week, and everybody going, yeah, and everybody going, well, what the heck happened now? So just know it's kind of like flying on airlines. It can go smooth, but you will get caught in some technical problems at some point in time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I love your suggestion to allot some time at the beginning to deal with any technical glitches. Sometimes, and something that if you have the capacity to do, First Report typically has like a backup person on our Zoom calls so that if technology fails one of us, hopefully somebody else is able to just jump right in with. So if you have the capacity to have somebody who's just designated as the technology helper, I think that that would also be helpful. So this goes along with what you were saying, Sandy. So briefly review any features that you plan to use during the meeting. So like I did at the beginning of this call, I kind of went over the features I anticipated that you all might need to use, which included the muting or turning off your video, using the chat if you want to leave a comment. So just making sure that people are familiar with where those are and just kind of talking through it if people have questions. And then we talked about reacting with nonverbal communication. So if you wanted to say, oh, I love that, you could do the American Sign Language for applause. So you could do kind of like the jazz hands for applause. And then like Adana is showing us, you could also use in Zoom, they have like the reactions that you can use. So going into clicking on participants in your toolbar, you should have a host of options. So if you click on more, you should be able to put your thumb up, put your thumb down. I think you can raise your hand and clap. You can also indicate that you need a break or you want to take, or if you need to step away, you can click away. So those are all kind of nonverbal ways to indicate, you know, what you're thinking during a meeting if it's a huge meeting and there's too many people to all talk at the same time. And Sandy demonstrated for us a lot of those reactions that you can use.
Well, now, where do you find, because I only had access to 2, where do you find more?
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to say. I only have thumbs up and a clap.
Yeah.
And did you click on more in participants section?
In participants, okay.
Under the participant. Okay, wait a minute. Oh, more. Okay. Oh, okay. But now
more options there.
In the chat, would that show up in the chat feature? Or is that going to show up on my screen?
It shows up on your video screen. So when you click on one, we'll all see it in your video square rectangle.
Okay, the gray ones are not doing it. Let's see if the blue one.
And that might be a setting that I accidentally have disabled. So this is really good for me to be able to learn this too.
Yeah.
I see that 2 of you have clapped. So it shows me as the host how many of you have clicked on the things.
Yeah. That shows that doesn't show up on my screen. Now under the react, I can do like that shows up right by my face.
Yes. And we can all see it.
Shows up in the chat box.
Right. And I'm not really sure if there are a way to send the reactions straight into the chat or not. That's a kind of good thing for me to maybe check on, but it does show up just in your video. Does anybody have any questions about that one? Or have we kind of figured out? So reacting with those nonverbal communication, if you wanted to like say, yes, I agree, or you can shake your head like, no, I don't agree, thumbs up, you know. So there's ways to nonverbally communicate in Zoom. And then also I see that a couple of us are using virtual backgrounds, so which I think is fun, and it's a fun way to connect with people as well. It can be an icebreaker, and it's also a chance to, you know, learn a new skill. So briefly, I'll just tell you guys how you could do that if you wanted to learn. I think maybe Kathy's gonna pull hers out too. So as a meeting host, you have to make sure that you go into your meeting settings and navigate to the virtual backgrounds option and turn that on so that all participants will be able to do it. So again, you go into your meeting section, your meeting settings, and then there's a virtual background tab. And then as a participant, it's easiest to turn on your virtual background, I think, if you have the desktop client downloaded. Do you all have the Zoom desktop client downloaded?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's handy to have. It's just, it can be down in your, you know, toolbar. And once you click on it, so you can click on your video icon in your toolbar now, and there's a little drop down arrow to the side of it. So click on that drop down arrow. And then you should be able to say, choose virtual background. And that would take you to your desktop client if you clicked on it and you already have the desktop client downloaded. And then it'll take you to the virtual background setting where you can choose a photo or a video like Sandy has chosen from just like the ones that they have. And I think that Karen has downloaded a photo and use that as her virtual background. And the same with me, I downloaded a photo and I used it as my virtual background. But if we have
Is that hard? Is that hard to download photos? No?
no, it's
Okay.
not at all.
And you can search free Zoom backgrounds.
Okay.
Just Google that, and they have a whole Star Wars theme. They have Tiger
Whoa.
King. My daughter meets once a week, and every week they do a different theme. Well, they're running out of themes now, so they've had to be really creative. But they've had some crazy backgrounds with those.
Okay.
Now, why is it that I don't look when I do my, because I mean, I guess I have stuff behind me, but it doesn't like I just like.
Yeah, it's best if you have a solid background behind you. So you have like your windows behind you and it's not the same like distance behind you as like the rest of your wall. So I think you have to be behind like a solid wall.
Okay, so to use it, you would need a solid wall. Okay.
Mhm.
Although, I mean, I don't know how come mine's working.
Yeah.
I'll be
I think
honest with you.
sometimes-
I just don't know. It just is. I don't know.
I think sometimes it may also have to do with the speed of your connection, maybe, and when it can, because I've noticed that some folks that use them if they have a slower connection, you'll even get a jagged kind of yeah, like Kathy's right
Maybe
now.
that's it, Kathy. I mean, that's a good suggestion on it too.
That's kind of an assumption on my part, but I've noticed that it's been with folks that say, "Oh, I often have trouble with my internet." So
yeah.
Well, I'd like to just do a shout out for the backgrounds, because having just added that this week, I can tell you that seeing my face with the beach behind me increases my mood. Okay.
Yeah, definitely brings joy, I think.
Yeah. As opposed to seeing what a wall that needs to be painted or a bedroom at the house. So I encourage folks to check it out because it is a mood elevator.
I agree. If you guys have any additional questions after this and you want to send an email, we could probably do like a 2-hour Zoom training if we really tried. There's a lot to learn about Zoom, but so I'm just going to go through a couple other tips. I already shared my screen once, and to do that, I have a little bit of a screenshot pulled up here. So you would click in your toolbar the new share or share screen button in your toolbar. Do you all see that? You're all allowed to do it. I've set that in the security settings, but
Okay.
but you would click on that, and then it pulls up this screen, the one that's on the screen right now. It pulls up this, and it has you select which screen you want to choose. So if you have multiple monitors, this is particularly important, or if you have multiple tabs open, you select which tab you wanted to open and share. And you also have that whiteboard option that's on there too. So that's the collaborative document that you can type into or draw on with a group. And then if you're sharing a video, you have to make sure that this square at the bottom where it says share computer sound is checked, as they won't be able to hear the audio that you're playing, which is something that I didn't know before I tried to play a video the other day. But does anybody have any tips or questions about sharing your screen on Zoom or how you might use it?
You would think that the audio would be a automatic, with the idea that if you did not want the sound, you would cut it off, That's just interesting logic.
It is interesting. And I did try with just not selecting that, and they could hear it, but just faintly because it was playing through my computer and it was picking up audio like when you talk, but it's not as connected. But
even with all that, Zoom is so much, I think, more friendly than Skype, more friendly than, what is it, Microsoft Teams or any of those types of things. I just find it to be the easier one. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is very user-friendly. Kathy, do you have a question or comment?
I was going to say the other day, and I don't know if you've used this, saying it Live Source. Have you used that one? It was on the other day, and it was really easy to use. The features were very similar to Zoom, but that was a new one for me. So
yeah. The next one that I wanted to talk about is breakout rooms. I want to be a little bit cognizant of time too, because we have some other important things to talk about. And I'm not sure, I can send everybody these tips for how to do them, but I really just want a conversation about how you would see breakout rooms being used in a meeting. If you wanted to have pair off or have small group conversations, tell me how you might use them, or if you think that that's not a feature you would use at all.
I wouldn't use it for my board meeting, but
I wouldn't,
but if I was trying to do something else, I could see myself using it. You know,
If you were
especially
having like
if
a committee meeting, do you think that you guys would ever break up into small groups within that committee, or is it already kind of a small group?
it's already a small group if we're doing committee meetings. But it is good to know that you could
Yeah.
do that, you know, so.
Yeah, and I'll definitely send these tips for everyone, but I won't spend too much time talking about how to actually set it up. We will send the PowerPoint though, and all these instructions. It is really easy just to, if you are hosting the meeting, just to break it up and it can randomize it for you into the amount of rooms that you want to have. So if you did decide that you wanted to pair off to have smaller conversations for just 5 minutes during your board meeting, you could very quickly just have Zoom split up your 10 participants into 5 different rooms with 2 people randomly, and then set it for 5 minutes. And then everybody will magically go into the breakout rooms and then pop back into the main meeting space 5 minutes later if you set that as the time. But if you ever do decide that that's something that you want to learn more about, you can always email Brushy Fork and we will help with setting that
Well,
up.
if our retreat on the 23rd does not work out and we do have to go virtual, I can see us absolutely having to use that for that.
Yeah, I think that would be a good opportunity. You're right, Sandy. All right. So the next tip that I was wanting to talk about is polling. Has anybody ever used the polling feature in Zoom or been in a meeting where they polled people? Kathy's shaking her head. Yep. So this allows you can set up as many questions as you want. You can do it in advance or you can do it in real time in the meeting, but it does take you out of the meeting to set it up in the meeting management system. So you can set up your question and then have it be either a single option or a single choice or multiple choice. They can select multiple, and you can also make them anonymous. So if you ever wanted to do anonymous polling to get feedback on how the meeting went, you could always end your meeting with, how did this meeting go? And you could have people you could have options like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you could do like a Likert scale and say if you felt like the meeting went poorly, 1, or if you felt the meeting went really well, 10, or anything in between. And that might be a good way to just get really quick feedback on your meeting if you were ever wanting to do a virtual meeting. All right, so out of these Zoom features that we've talked about, does anybody have any questions about them, or can you think about any way that you would use them that we didn't really talk about? So we're going to quickly just talk about the leadership roles and responsibilities during board meetings. So these are outlined in the affiliate manual. But we also recognize that each affiliate community foundation is operating in the way that works best for their board, and it might look a little bit different than this. The main point to take away from this is that these responsibilities from the roles just still need to be fulfilled. So if that looks a little bit different for each board, then that's okay. But I think, again, communication is just key here. So the chair's responsibility is to convene the meetings, send out the meeting reminders, remind people of the location and the time, send out the meeting agenda, to both the board members and also the foundation. And then also to remind any board members about their action items that they agreed to from the last meeting. And, you know, the secretary's roles are to record the meeting minutes and then send them to the foundation, and also to all of the board members, especially those who maybe had to miss the meeting, so that they can read up on what they missed. And then the treasurer is supposed to collect and compile any gifts that are received at that meeting in compliance with the contribution submission guidelines outlined in the affiliate manual. Kathy, do you have any other addition, or Sandy, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say the treasurer is also responsible for outlining the financial reports and walking the board through those with regard to where the organization stands in terms of its endowment, its spendable accounts, and its funds.
Wonderful. That's a good responsibility to outline. So thank you for letting us know. And we can include that in the PowerPoint when we send it back out to folks so that they see that.
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
Kathy, do you have any other additions on this topic?
No, I'm good.
Great.
Luckily, we don't require a sergeant at arms, you know? I mean, I would hate it that we'd have that situation where it's just like, and you need somebody to escort somebody out.
Yes. So yeah, and just if you do have any questions about that, I think that the foundation would probably be happy to talk to you about the roles and responsibilities that they see for the affiliate community foundations. I think that it's crucial that during meetings, especially those that are happening virtually, that you allow time for check-ins at the beginning, just to get that personal connection, because in virtual meetings, we're missing out on those hallway conversations and just those informal, hey, how are you? So I think that it's really important to just kind of allow time for that in the virtual meeting. And I think that's another place where the breakout sessions come in. If you wanted to do a quick pair off or a quick like small group check-in so that everybody feels heard, but you only have a couple minutes, that might be another way that you could use that. Also, review the proposed agenda at the beginning of the meeting. We've talked about why that's important to kind of jointly design the next steps. Also, we want to encourage participation from the whole group. So Donna's about to kind of talk about how we can encourage participation from the whole group. We also want to evaluate the meeting process at the end with that plus minus change. And also allot time to brainstorm the agenda topics for your next meeting so that the person who's creating the agenda isn't trying to rack their brain for what needs to be discussed. It's more of a collaborative effort. And then end on time. I think that that's also a really good one. It's one that I hope that we're doing today too. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Donna to talk about these facilitation techniques for meetings.
Okay. And I know that we're saying we want to end on time, but I will just say that there is no way that we're going to be able to end this in 2 minutes and get through this material. So I want to honor your all's time. And so we can approach this one of two ways. We can extend this out for about another maybe 10 minutes and run past the end of the call, or we could put this off and do it at a future meeting. So if you are okay with continuing now for about another 10 minutes, give me a thumbs up like this. If you don't want to, give me a thumbs down.
Where's
It
my?
will be recorded. So
Okay, and it will be recorded. So I'm seeing mostly thumbs up. So I'm going to go ahead and go and move through these, and I'll try to get through it in about 10 minutes. And so
great. Thank you,
what
Donna. I appreciate it.
that's okay. No problem. So we had great conversations. So it was worth, and the Zoom tips are wonderful. And we're going to connect back into them with these facilitation techniques. And so these are facilitation techniques that you can use either in live meetings or on Zoom. And so they are transferable for the most part. Maybe not all of them, but I'll kind of explain. So let's go through and talk about, if you're the person who's asked to lead one of these sections on the agenda, what are some techniques that you can use to lead that? So Jacqueline's already kind of gone through the brainstorming technique. You know, she described that earlier with when we were talking about effective meetings. And so the trick to brainstorming is to make it visual. So you want to capture those ideas as people are brainstorming up on a flip chart in real time, or you want to capture them on that Zoom whiteboard or some other document that people are viewing online if you're doing an online meeting. In this case, sometimes it's helpful to have somebody recording for you if you're the facilitator and it's hard for you to facilitate and capture things at the same time. Then ask somebody in the group to be a scribe for you, either on a flip chart or on the screen itself. And so the key as the facilitator for you to think about is that you want to keep people from jumping to the evaluation phase. That's actually what happens many times is somebody wants to comment on an idea that somebody brings up. When you're brainstorming, you do not evaluate. We're just trying to get a quantity of ideas up there. So it's about quantity and not quality. It's fine for people, as a facilitator, you can say to them, it is fine for people to build off one of those ideas. In fact, we want that to happen because somebody may throw out some wild idea, some scheme that you go would never happen. But just based on that, somebody may have an idea that's a lot more doable. And so even those far-fetched ideas can result in something that ends up being doable for the group. Brainstorming, if you're in a situation where people just seem kind of ho-hum and we're trying to get started on something, brainstorming is a way to raise the energy in the room or on the virtual meeting. So that's a little bit about brainstorming. So let's talk about individual writing now. Have you ever been in a group and you have had an idea to share, but the group is really super active and it's hard to get in? And if you're an introvert, it's especially hard to get your voice raised up as people are talking. So for introverts, brainstorming can be almost a painful process in that I got to get my word in, and you just can't get in. And so as a facilitator, one of the things that you can provide for people is an opportunity to just take a couple minutes and individually write and gather their thoughts. And you can have something there as simple as having some index cards that you hand out, slips of paper that you've cut to quarter size of the paper that you hand out to the group, Post-it notes that you could use later and actually post on a wall or on a flip chart to capture people's ideas. You could use individual writing in those ways. It's a way to focus the group. If you've got a group that's being kind of rowdy and out of hand for some reason, then you can focus them this way. And you can also provide a path for quiet people to enter the conversation. And so the facilitator's role in terms of individual writing is to craft a very clear question that you want to have people respond to. And so that relates back to that question-based agenda. If you're going to start the communication or the conversation process with doing writing, then you want to start with a very clear question. And so again, for this, I mean, you would think of it mostly in live meetings because you've got people sitting around the table and that's where you do it. If you're doing it in a live meeting, what you could do is if there's a contentious topic that people are talking about perhaps, and people will write what they're thinking, their opinion of the topic, and they hand it all into the facilitator, and the facilitator can read those anonymously, or you can pass them around to the group and have them read them so that people are reading other people's thoughts. It's a way sometimes to kind of like shift the discussion out of a contentious space and allow people to express themselves. And so you could also do this with a Zoom meeting or an online meeting. If you just tell people, we're going to take a couple minutes, give people a minute to write if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, or if you just want to type on your computer screen or whatever, to use that individual writing that way. Pairing off is the next technique. So it's pretty much what it sounds like. You're asking people to pair up and have a conversation. This technique works well also if you are working in a group where people seem to be hesitant to talk, or you're discussing a difficult issue and people maybe are not feeling heard, and you want to give everybody a chance to express and a chance to be heard. And so you have people choose a partner that they talk to. This is in a live meeting. You just pair them up. Either the facilitator says, you two, you two, you two, you two, or you count off 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or you have people self-select who they want to pair up with. Use your kind of your instinct as a facilitator as to whether or not it makes more sense to force people to go with somebody they don't know to have a conversation or not. So, think about those types of things. This is a good way if there's a meeting that's kind of dull and dead and nobody's talking, to raise the energy in the room again. So if people just don't seem to be engaged in a topic, you can say, all right, we're going to pair off and talk about this and share each other's opinions. And then when people are finished discussing in pairs, then they can share back to the whole group. If you're using Zoom, Jacqueline mentioned breakout rooms earlier. You can randomly just do 2 people in a breakout room, quickly pair them off for 10 minutes. Tell them you've got 10 minutes, you want 5 minutes a person, so keep track of your time and make sure both people get a chance to talk. As a facilitator, that's part of your role to remind people we're 5 minutes in, so make sure the second person gets a chance to talk if you're doing a 10-minute session, But you can use breakout rooms on Zoom that way, or you can do this live. Then there are small group discussions. And of course, that's pretty obvious too, what that means. You've got groups of more than, well, they could be 2, but groups that could be, 4, 6, 8. This technique works really well if you have a topic that has a lot of facets to it and you can break those out, or if you are doing something that you have several topics that you want to talk about at once. Large groups can actually accomplish more in a shorter amount of time by breaking out into these discussion groups and generating conversation and generating information about it. So let's, for example, let's say that we are doing strategic planning and we have 3 areas we want to talk about: donor development, grant funding for projects that come in, so grant funding criteria, and changing our board structure. So let's say we have 30 minutes or an hour for a meeting for this. If you break people into 3 groups for 15-minute discussions in each group, you're essentially accomplishing 45 minutes worth of work in 15 minutes, because each of those groups will have specific questions again that they address when they're in the breakout group, but they're having those discussions and coming back to the whole group with some of the answers. And the whole group doesn't have to start with the nitty-gritty of those discussions. There can be some processing that's done before they bring it back to the whole group. So again, remember our question-based agenda and use that to inform the questions that the small groups would be discussing. It's very important for the facilitator, if we talk about the role of the facilitator or the chair in breaking out these groups, for them to define what the purpose is for these groups. If the groups go into this process thinking they're going in to make a decision, but that's not the purpose, then you're going to end up with some frustrated people at the end. And so it could be, you know, that at the beginning of the small group meetings, you say, this is to generate information and to process and to bring that back to the group so the whole group can make a decision. And so in most cases, I think this small group work, especially in the case of a board where there's a structure for making decisions, the small group work is going to be about giving input and processing information. This could be done in person in board meetings, as in-person meetings, or it can be done online using those breakout rooms again. So let's talk about round robin. So somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Randy, who said, I'm one of those people who just nods all the time, you know, and doesn't necessarily speak up. And so round robin is a technique to get those people to talk. And it's pretty simple. It's simply just going around the group and giving each person an opportunity to respond. So the facilitator's role is to explain that responses should be brief, because you can't have one person, you know, doing a monologue of 30 minutes. This can be a good follow-up to the individual writing piece so that people who are introverted have a chance to gather their thoughts. If you put introverts on the spot, they'll be like, I pass, and because they haven't had time to gather and process. But it is okay for people to say I pass as well if they really don't have anything to contribute. So just going around making sure that each person contributes. This can be done online or in person. There may be situations where you ask somebody, okay, we want to go around and get 2 items for this list that we're putting on the flip chart. And so what we're going to do is 2 rounds so that we do the first round robin and just give us your first item. And then the second round robin, give us your second item. Because many times what happens if you go and people give multiple items is, you know, later on in the group, somebody says, well, they've already put up everything for me. And so just to have it go in rounds like that lets people feel like they're being more engaged. So that's round robin. So those are techniques to explore ideas. I'll stop there and ask for questions real quickly if anybody has any questions about that.
Donna, I just had a comment. You know, the chairman of the board, your talent in your board are not always, you could get a chairman who is willing to help lead, help make decisions, and those types of things. Doesn't necessarily mean that that person brings facilitation skills.
Right.
And I don't, you know, I've not thought about that for our board, but other boards might think about it that, you know, if somebody else on the board is a good facilitator, you might be able to engage them without relinquishing the authority of the chair, but just to make sure that facilitation is happening in a manner that is comfortable for everybody.
That's right. You can absolutely do that, is bring in somebody if they've got facilitation experience or facilitation skills. And not only can they help run the meeting, but they can teach other board members how to do that. Because if you are splitting up those board agenda items the way we talked about in that question-based agenda, and you've got different people responsible for different areas, they can use these techniques as ways to generate conversation and really, you know, engender that participation and engagement that you're hoping for from all the board members. So absolutely. And I mean, we're going to have handouts that we send you all to follow up on these that explain how to do these processes. They're really not rocket science, although there is, you know, there's a little bit of practice involved with it. And once you practice it, you get more comfortable with it. And you do have to be able to be attentive to how the group is responding and recognize body language and things like that. But they are things that anybody can do, and with practice, anybody can improve with them. So let's talk a little bit about techniques for decision making. And these decision making techniques are really focused more on consensus. Really, although, and I know that with a board structure, most decision making is done by vote. But you pretty much, even when you're doing votes, you want everybody to kind of have really considered things, and you want buy-in from your board members, even if it is a voting process. And so if you've got a majority rules kind of situation, but the majority is only, 51 to 49, there could be a split in the board that could be detrimental possibly in some ways in terms of jointly designing next steps. And so if we think about that concept again of being effective in your meetings and jointly designing next steps. Thinking about things, even if you're going to vote later, in terms of consensus can be helpful. So these are processes that you can use to kind of gauge things with the group. Now, the first one is called Fist to 5, and this is something that really works better live, probably because you're able to see everybody. But if you've got a small enough meeting online and you've got the grid opened up so you can see every person on the call, you could still use this. And it's the equivalent of a scale of 0 to 5, essentially, on a topic. So what you're trying to do, let's say, is determine how strongly each person supports a decision or supports an idea that's out there. And so 0 is the fist. 0 means I can't support it. I'm totally against it. It's just not going to work for me. 5 is I am all in. I will be there every day to help work on this. And then there's every number in between. So, you know, people can vote with a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. And I said vote, but it's really kind of really just sharing where they are consensus-wise. So the facilitator's role in this is to define in a very clear statement, what is it that we are talking about, that you're sharing your input on, and do we all understand what that means? And so it's that sharing what important words mean and creating a shared understanding about important words. If we have determined that, yeah, everybody understands what we're talking about here, then we say, okay, everybody tell us where you're feeling, where you are right now in terms of supporting this decision. And each person holds up a hand. If you have more people holding up a 0, a 1, or a 2, then you know, you might consider talking about that idea more before you vote on it, just because either the vote's not going to pass or there's probably going to be a pretty big division in the group. And so it just gives you, you know, a way to kind of gauge that. The next thing we want to talk about is setting criteria. So setting criteria, when you're working on a brainstormed list or any other list for that matter, having a group determine their interests and determine their reasoning and intent for why they want to make a decision can be helpful. So criteria are the factors that the group needs to consider in order to make the decision. And we're going to practice this in a minute, is what we'd like to do. And I'm already over more than my 10 minutes. And so I don't know that we'll practice this, Jacqueline. Maybe we'll just talk about it. So anyway, so the group comes up with criteria. So let's say you're with a farmer's market and you want to make a decision about the desserts that you want to serve at a fundraising picnic that you're having. And so the criteria that this farmer's market selects is they say, we want it to be made with products from the farmer's market. We want to make sure that it's not perishable so it can sit out in the sun. We want to make sure that there's something that people who need a low sugar diet can eat. And somebody says, and I want to make sure that something has chocolate in it. And so we've got these 4 criteria. There's this brainstorm list of things like banana pudding and chocolate cake and ice cream and blueberry muffins. And so ice cream obviously is perishable, can't sit out in the sun, right? So we can automatically eliminate that from our list. So what that criteria does is it helps us eliminate, and then we can move to this idea of straw polls. And a lot of people have seen this done with sticky dots, right? Where you've got a list on a flip chart, people get colored dots, they get maybe 2 colored dots and can pick their top 2 items. And so they go up and they put their dots by them. If they have criteria that they're using to help them decide where to put their dots, then you could get a visual of how the group feels about the different items on the list. You can eliminate things that didn't get many dots. You can circle the things that really have a lot of dots beside them. And the trick here is to get that criteria generated and agreed upon, and then to assign however many dots you want to assign. And that can depend on the size of the group. If you have a group of 5 people trying to make a decision about 10 items, then maybe you say pick your top 2. And you give 2 dots and people can pick their top 2. If you have a group of 40 people trying to choose among 25 items, then you might say, all right, folks, let's pick our top 5 that we're going to try to discuss further. And so people can pick 5 items among those. And it's very interesting because when you have those criteria, typically what you end up with is more people. I mean, you'll have more dots around those top few items that rise to the top, and it just immediately gets that list down to something that's a lot more discussable. There is a way to do that on Zoom. We were going to show you, but it's basically using that whiteboard. You have a list on that whiteboard, and there is a function called annotate on the whiteboard that is under, it's under security, I think.
Yeah, under security, you can allow all participants to annotate. And
Okay,
then
so
once you're in it, you'll have the option to write.
right. So once you're in, and sorry to cut off the practice, but I just
No, it's totally
we're
fine.
running
I
over.
think that you guys
Yeah.
will get it as long as,
Yeah.
and the thing about Zoom is that you can't break it. So just if you ever do want to just
That's
do
right.
it, have a practice call and get in
That's
there.
right.
Just
Yeah.
to-
And so, yeah, the whiteboard has stamps that you can use as dots, basically. If you have a list, people can put their dots on as stamps. So those are techniques.
Hey, does anybody have any questions about those for Donna? The last thing that I just wanted to mention is this kind of question. So how do we keep our momentum in between meetings? So this isn't something that we need to talk about right now, but maybe this is something when you're talking about this webinar with your boards, maybe this is something you can all consider, like how are we encouraging and invigorating our board members? So the ones that I kind of wrote down here are to assign action items during each meeting so that people can have tangible things to accomplish before the next meeting. Also to create some subcommittees, which I think that a lot of boards will create some subcommittees or small groups to work on specific tasks. I see some of you nodding your heads like that's something that you all do. And then the last one was to just encourage one another. I heard a really cool idea recently to create like accountability buddies with other people on your team or your board that kind of help just hold each other responsible for what you've said you would do, and also to encourage you. So if you are stuck on something, that person, you can turn to them and they might have some helpful tips or encouragement for you that will help you complete any action items or just contribute to your fullest potential on your board. But do you all have any thoughts about that before we end? That's kind of our last item today. I know we've gone a little over.
I think those are all good. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, especially the accountability. Yeah, I think that's important for follow-up for the next meeting.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate getting to see all of your faces, and we will be sending the follow-up materials with those handouts, some Zoom tips, and also the facilitation techniques, and also this PowerPoint and the recording. If you need anything else or have any other questions, feel free to email Donna or myself or Daniel at Brushy Fork. And we look forward. Donna, do you have anything to add about the planning sessions for the boards?
Just that I know the Upper Cumberland Community Foundation has scheduled theirs for September 23rd. And so if Karen, if Breathitt County wants to do a planning process to help kind of create a community investment plan and talk about things like the values for the group and that kind of thing, then feel free to contact us and we can do that.
Okay, I'll check with them and let you know, okay?
Okay, yep, and we'll either do that by Zoom or we'll try to figure out a way to come to you safely to do it. And I know your board members will probably have to figure out a way to come to you if the college will let us travel. So the other thing that we can do is we can do a facilitation training itself as one of these webinars so that we get more in depth into those tools that we talked about. And that way, if you have board members, Sandy, who you think would benefit from learning some facilitation skills, then we can just include that as one of these webinars, maybe, is to do more about really facilitation. So
I think you ought to just go ahead and put that on the list.
okay.
And we'll do our best to try to encourage some folks to take advantage of that because these are these are skill sets no matter what that will help you in life. So
Good.
yeah.
Good. And then our next webinar is in July. I think it's either the 27th or the 28th. 28th, thank you. And what we're trying to line up for that webinar right now is to bring in Ann Nash to talk about donor development. So
Good.
yeah, so that's what we're working on. If we can't get her then, we may get her in the future. But that's hopefully our next webinar will be around donor development. But we will plan to do one on facilitation too. Okay. So,
any other suggestions for future topics before we end?
Tell me who Ann Nash is again.
Kathy, do you? So she's a consultant, right? And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and she does, that is what she consults on, is mainly donor development. I'd have to pull up.
Yeah, I
Well,
think
is
she
she
might have been
national?
the former director of the Bluegrass Community Foundation.
Okay, that's why her name sounds familiar. Okay, that's
I was
why her
trying
name.
to think of which one, but yeah.
Yeah, I think she was the former director of Bluegrass Community Foundation, and she
Okay.
has done many trainings for people on donor development, and is supposed to be top notch. And so we're hoping that she'll
Okay.
agree to do this for us. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking her name sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure if it was coming out of the Appalachian Funder Network or where. So,
yeah.
okay.
So,
All right.
Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see
everybody,
you next
thanks for hanging in there.
All right. Bye, guys.